From Recorded Future News and PRX, this is Click Here. Hi, it's Dina. While the Click Here team takes a brief winter break, we want to share an episode from our friends over at Kaleidoscope. They make some terrific tech podcasts, and one of the shows we've been really enjoying is Kill Switch. Host Dexter Thomas has a gift for helping listeners make sense of the right now of our tech-fueled lives. And back in early November, he turned his attention to a massive internet outage tied to Amazon Web Services, the cloud provider behind many of the world's most essential online services. When big chunks of the internet suddenly went dark, Amazon traced the issue to a data center in Northern Virginia, which left the Kill Switch team with one big question. How did this happen? Take a listen.
We have breaking news for you this morning. A widespread internet outage has caused major disruptions for some of the biggest web services in the world.
There's a good chance today that some website, app, or service that you tried to use today was down. That's following an outage from Amazon Web Services.
Amazon Web Services, the backbone of the internet, suffered a major outage that took hundreds of services offline across the globe.
Monday morning, October 20th, Americans woke up to news of a massive internet outage. And it wasn't just America.
I think one of the things to really note about this outage is that it was one of the biggest in recent history. In my decade in the field, this definitely ranks in the top 5.
Dr. Corinne Kath is a culture anthropologist, and she works at the human rights organization Article 19. She researches internet infrastructure, AI, cloud computing, and basically how technology affects our day-to-day lives.
I have asked some of my colleagues, veterans of the field who've been in the industry since the internet was born, and they pretty much said the same thing. This was huge.
A lot of people didn't necessarily know that there was some global internet outage going on. They just knew that there was some website or service that they used that wasn't working, like their favorite messaging app, or even their smart bed.
Some of these are kind of benign or even funny. There were some excellent threads on the internet about people who had internet-connected mattresses.
Oh, the beds. Yes.
Yes, the beds. Oh my God, AirPods. Shout out to AirPods and everyone who thought it was a good idea to buy an internet-connected bed. I swear to God, this is why we don't have a single interconnected device in our house.
Corinne's talking about these really expensive smart beds by this company called 8 Sleep. Their mattresses are supposed to track your biometric data and get hotter or cooler depending on what your body needs. They're also connected to the internet, and apparently they didn't work offline. After the outage started, some of the mattresses overheated or wouldn't recline. Thinking about somebody's $2,500 internet smart bed going vertical and trying to cook them alive is kind of dystopian, but it goes beyond that. This thing took down everything from Amazon's own products like Ring doorbells and Alexa, to sites like Reddit, to messaging apps like Signal, to government services. These outages can impact basically every part of your life.
This isn't just me being on Duolingo or me being on Snapchat, right? It is banking, it is the hospitals, it is education, it is things that matter in my life, that matter in everyone's life.
The world today relies on basically 3 major cloud computing services. When one of those goes down, so does a huge chunk of the internet. So what causes these outages? How do we get to the point where so much of the internet relies on just 3 big tech companies? And can that ever change? From Kaleidoscope and iHeart Podcasts, this is Kill Switch. I'm Dexter Thomas.
Goodbye.
What exactly happened on October 20th?
So what essentially happened is that there was an outage within Amazon Web Services. Now, Amazon Web Services is a leading cloud computing company. And what is super important to know is that Amazon currently has at least 30% of the global cloud market share.
We sometimes think of the cloud as something that lives in this virtual space, not as something tangible. But the cloud relies on very real and physical data centers that are located around the world. These things store code and data and move around that data to make the apps that you use or the internet run. And as Corinne just pointed out, about a third of the global internet relies on one company for cloud computing, Amazon Web Services.
This company operates data centers worldwide that a lot of the internet and a lot of applications rely on. And so what happened is within their data center clusters, one of the oldest and biggest one had a bug in the automation software that subsequently took down all of the companies that relied on that data center.
Basically, the reason this outage was so widespread was because there was an issue with one specific and heavily relied upon data center that's located in Virginia.
I've seen estimates of, 1 billion pings per day going to this particular data center in Virginia. And a ping is essentially like when a company needs something from that database. And because this data center was one of the biggest and one of the oldest, about 35 to 40% of all AWS traffic goes through it. Another reason why this impact was so big is if you are a software developer and you buy AWS to develop your software on, this region is the default. So if you don't switch the default, this is where your stuff will be housed.
And so you have a third of the world's internet relying on this one company. Within that, there's this one data center that becomes the default for all kinds of new apps and websites. That data center had a DNS error. The DNS, the domain name system, translates a written website into an IP address that a computer can then decode and understand. You might have heard this described as the phone book of the internet, but Corinne has a better explanation.
So I'm going to try and do a different metaphor to explain this, because the phone book is really useful in the sense that what it does, it connects names to numbers, right? And that is what the domain name system does. So when you type in a website, you type in riverside.fm, not the very long number that is behind it, which is actually how, machines find each other. The problem with the phone book metaphor is I've held one. I know what they look like and what they feel like, but most people younger than me, that is not a helpful metaphor at all. So the way that I try to explain what happened with AWS is imagine you're using Google Maps or Waze or some sort of navigation app because you want to go to the library because you need a specific book to do your job. But essentially what happens is there's a software bug and that causes your app, your map app, to essentially indicate that the library no longer exists. Even though the library is right there, right? It is fully operational, but you just no longer can see how to get there. And you're stuck with two problems. The first one being is you cannot navigate to the library. And secondly, you cannot access the information that you need. And so you can't do your work. And that's essentially what happened with the AWS outage. But the problem is you're not the only one who needs the library. The writer on your team needs access to it for research. The accountant needs it for whatever, financial records or software. Your lawyer needs it for the database with case law, right? But when the map says the library doesn't exist, it pretty much doesn't show up. And so everyone's work stops simultaneously. And what AWS figured out is fixing that map is not easy. You have to take all of these steps. You have to identify which version of the mapping software each person is using, push all of the updates to all of the systems, wait for everything to restart, and then verify that everyone can see the library again on the map. And then you get this really interesting part where when you fixed it and the library is reachable again, there's a stampede because everyone realizes oh, it's back up. So we now all need to go there. And everyone who's done Black Friday shopping knows what that leads to. And that is also why it took so long, right? Because one thing is fixing the problem. And subsequently, you have to deal with the backlog of everyone trying to get through the door simultaneously and the system not being able to deal with that either.
This isn't the first time that cloud services have had an error like this, but because of how many applications rely not only on AWS, but on this one data center, the effects of the outage were really widespread. And outages of this scale can cause some very real problems.
This is not the first outage, not the first big one, right? The last big one was on the 19th of July, 2024. And the reason why I remember that date so precisely is because it happens to be the day that my second-born was born. And for reasons, I had to be rushed to the hospital. And it was like urgent. This was no joke. And that was another day that there was a massive outage, but this time it was CrowdStrike Microsoft Cloud.
In this incident last year in 2024, what happened was a faulty update by the security company CrowdStrike caused a major outage for Microsoft's Azure cloud services. This one brought down airlines, banks, and even emergency services.
The massive Microsoft outage impacting businesses around the world, taking some companies temporarily offline and forcing major American airlines to ground flights.
The outage affected government entities and news organizations, as well as almost every industry across the globe, including banks, airports, healthcare providers, and retailers.
There were a number of hospitals in the Netherlands where I'm based, where those issues were such that they couldn't help patients. Now, luckily, that wasn't in my region. But when you're in an ambulance being sped to a hospital, you don't want to show up there on the other end and them telling you, I'm sorry, computer says no. You know, it's the apps and it's the benign stuff, but it's also the very serious stuff that we have connected to these clouds. Healthcare, education, banking, access to your government. These are all things that are so critical for people's lives. Like, what happens when that is not accessible? I mean, I am sure that there are people who missed funerals, who were not able to make really crucial payments that needed to be made that day, that didn't get whatever benefits that they really needed to. This is not an incident because it keeps happening. When this happened, like the organization that I work for, Article 19, like we had a blog out within 2 hours at best. And people were like, wow, you guys are so fast. Like, how did you put that together? And I'm like, well, it's kind of depressing because this is the fourth time in 4 years that I see an outage quite like this. And all I have to do every time is I switch out the name of the company and I look into the specifics of where they failed technically. And then it's the same op-ed. And so we just, here we are.
That is depressing. That is depressing. It's wild, too. You said it keeps happening. You might already know this, but I asked you on to talk about AWS. Do you know Minecraft is down right now?
Oh, I did not see that. Because I was preparing for talking to you guys and not...
not doing your job. I kept you from doing your job. But yeah, no. I think Xbox is down right now. Microsoft's Azure was once again experiencing an outage. At that point in the interview, all I'd seen was that Xbox and Minecraft were down. But as always, it's bigger than that. It turns out banks got hit with it too, and so did parts of the train system, which was a problem because it also happened to be election day in the Netherlands where Corinne is, and the disruptions in Dutch railways meant that some people might not be able to make it home in time to vote. So the outage was directly interfering with the democratic process. Microsoft's share of cloud computing isn't as big as Amazon's, but it's a close second. And together with Google, these three companies make up almost 2/3 of the entire cloud infrastructure, meaning that 2/3 of the internet relies on Google, Amazon, and Microsoft keeping their act together. So how did we get here? After the break, the origin story of Amazon Web Services. How did we get to the point where the bookseller became the backbone of most of the internet?
So there are multiple origin stories around like how AWS became AWS. A lot of the work that people put out there now like very much follows AWS's iteration of events. We were an e-commerce platform. We needed a lot of compute to be able to do that. And then at one point they realized in addition to selling the books, we can sell whatever compute capacity we don't need ourselves.
In this version of the story, Amazon Web Services kind of started as a side hustle, with Amazon renting out the extra computer capacity that they had to other companies. Fortune magazine did an interview with Amazon's current CEO, Andy Jassy, who started out as the head of Amazon Web Services. He said that in the early 2000s, Amazon was starting to run into walls when they were developing features for the site. Remember, at this point, they were still mainly thought of as a bookseller. So they started building out internal features for their own programmers to use. And they realized that they could sell that infrastructure to other companies.
So that is like the long short of it. There's a lot more nuance there. And I think some really great internet historians are going to be picking through that to bring the inside story. What is definitely true is that they were the first.
In 2006, Amazon Web Services was born, and it was instantly popular. They were solving for a problem that companies were already starting to have. Before this, starting an app company could be really risky, partially because of how unpredictable the traffic demands could be. Let's say you start up a company and your online service just goes viral overnight. Well, if you didn't buy enough servers ahead of time, you can't keep up with demand and you're screwed. But if you did buy a bunch of servers and your company isn't doing so well, now you're stuck with a building full of servers and you're wasting money, and now you're really screwed. What AWS did was let companies rent that computing space and power as opposed to having to buy it outright themselves. Basically, they let them do what a lot of us do: pay Amazon a subscription fee. If your business gets popular, just rent more space. If you have a slow month or two, you can scale it back. And on top of that, AWS had software development tools, which meant that you could build on top of those tools rather than having to start from scratch. This was huge for the Web 2.0 boom. It allowed for a lot of experimentation without as much financial risk, which in some ways felt like a good thing. But it also meant that the internet became really reliant on Amazon.
Companies have gone from largely running their own servers, like physical computers in their own garages, so to speak, to relying on the servers of AWS. But maybe even more importantly, we've also gone from individual companies building software from scratch to compiling it from various building blocks provided by other software companies. What you then get is that you create this really complex web of dependencies and interconnections where every piece of software relies on another piece of software, which relies on another piece of software.
However it might have started, AWS is not a side hustle now. It brought in almost $40 billion in operating income last year. That's over half of what Amazon made. Amazon beat Google and Microsoft to the punch here, but both those companies eventually offered their own competing services. And now we have this environment of 3 companies controlling the cloud that houses the internet. And what was first just an extension of basically using someone else's computer for storage has turned into something much, much bigger.
I think that is the next sort of step that we need to take, where it's in what situation would you accept, only 3 companies being responsible for all of agriculture? We would immediately see how big of a chokehold that would be, because we understand how important food is for our daily sustenance. We need to start changing our perception of what the digital is, because it is everything.
The food comparison is really interesting. You want a tomato, you want a hamburger, you want, I don't know, man, some spaghetti. All of those, I don't know why I thought of those 3. That maybe I'm hungry right now.
Time for some pasta bolo, yeah.
But all of those 3 things are, if one company goes down, if one of those companies has a problem, if one of those companies is not safe for some reason, starts slacking on safety regulations or whatever, you don't get one of those 3 or 2 of those 3 or all of those 3 or whatever.
Or you don't eat. Yeah.
Yeah, you just don't eat.
There is a reason why these 3 keep getting bigger, because they are also the only ones with that amount of money to put into something that loses its value quite quickly, right? Servers, infrastructure, it's expensive to build, it's expensive to maintain, and you have to switch it out every 5 to 7 years. I've spoken to VCs for research purposes, just get a sense of when you get a startup and you look at their proposition, and for instance, they would say actually, we either want to build our own set of servers, our own mini cloud, or we would want to work with multiple partners. And these VCs just burst out laughing at just the proposition of that, because they were well, if I'm putting my money into this and they're going to spend it on something that gives me no return, when they could just do it with AWS or whomever was going to do it cheaper and better, at least from their perspective, I would just never fund. I would never fund something that would also require my money to put into machines that are going to die in the next 5 years. It's a bad investment.
Right now, smaller companies really can't compete with these giants. So you could argue here that it's better that we have these big tech companies monopolizing this. They have more resources and they can afford to maintain the data centers and keep them working. And maybe that is a way to keep things cheap and reliable. But for Corinne, that's not a good enough reason.
The thing that I think is important to remember is that these technical outages have political consequences. So it is really important to politicize what is happening here. Because it's very easy for people to say, like, oh, it's just a technical mistake and we should be allowed to make technical mistakes. But that is not an argument that we would accept from, the company that operates our water or our electricity. For them to just be like, I'm sorry, it's winter, but for the next 12 hours, no heat in your house or no clean water. So your kids are thirsty, too bad. And somehow with these companies, we've decided that they get a pass, or like maybe even better, like they've just lobbied such that there isn't that much or enough, at least from my perspective, oversight on, them making these mistakes and that having really potentially life-altering consequences. And that I very much see as a democratic deficit.
So what can we do about this? How do we take back computing power from the hands of a few big corporations? That's after the break. The same week as the AWS outage, political leaders in Europe met in Brussels for a summit, and one of the items on the agenda was this idea of European digital sovereignty, basically figuring out a way to untangle Europe from being so reliant on these big US tech companies.
I'm actually quite critical of people who are very focused on like European digital sovereignty, because I'm like, well, the world's a big place, and like you just, Fort Europe is where you put your digital borders. Like that's not good enough. The perspective needs to be one of global solidarity always. And I have been in the room with politicians representing, the Greens or left-wing parties back home, who without irony have said, oh, well, we need to start looking for alternatives, but the only ones that are perhaps available to us or that have experience running these kind of networks at that kind of skill are defense contractors. And I would be sitting there picking my jaw from the floor being like, wait, the choice that we are giving ourselves here is AWS or defense contractors, right? That is a rock and a hard place. We have to think of something else that is not this.
Instead of looking to Silicon Valley or the military for the answer, Corinne says we should be thinking about nonprofits and universities for ideas here.
Now, it's not impossible. Wikipedia does it. They specifically have a setup that has them, I want to say, like across 7 different data centers across numerous continents, and none of them are the big 3. But that would be much harder to do for something like Signal, right? Where latency and like constant uptime is much more visible when it doesn't work than with something like Wikipedia. There are alternatives, but it requires us to also change our expectations. And it requires the people, more importantly, like who put money into this, who literally have skin in the game, to change theirs. So it's cultural change as well. It's not only technical. Locally, we work with small, medium enterprises to see what they are thinking of. The universities in the Netherlands have taken some really interesting steps where they have all come together with local providers to say okay, well, we are roughly the same kind of institute. Here are the needs that we all have. Could you build us something that is fit for purpose for universities?
So there is a kind of precedent for what Corinne's advocating here. And the day we did this interview was also an important anniversary.
Today is the 29th of October, which is ARPANET launch day. ARPANET is the precursor to the internet. And in October 29th, 1969, the first message was sent over the ARPANET.
So the ARPANET was basically a pre-internet network that was developed as a collaboration between universities and the US Department of Defense way back in the 60s.
And it's interesting because like that version of the internet was designed to be resilient. It was designed to route around problems or failures like the ones that we saw with AWS. It was designed to fundamentally like not have choke points and concentration points.
And so you're taking us back to ARPANET.
I can't believe that is where we. It's full circle.
No, but I mean, isn't that what's happening? We're talking about universities without a profit motive.
Yeah,
which is really important here. Without a profit motive, figuring out ways to connect to each other with no singular choke point, and then figuring, okay, well, I think we've got a system that works. Everybody else copy it.
But that is still operating from the assumption that we need to be moving to a world of more compute. And some of the people that I really take inspiration from in the field are, academics, researchers, colleagues, but also like artists and organizers who are building technologies, but also ideas and also political worlds that provide actual alternatives. And two sort of examples that I think might be interesting is the Critical Infrastructure Lab at the University of Amsterdam and the Institute for Technology in the Public Interest, which is based out of Brussels. And they are doing super fascinating stuff. They are literally like building compostable data centers. They are generating energy out of mud just to show like how hard it is to get energy and like how much of it data centers consume. They are creating like cloud abolitionist agendas. And like that is the kind of thinking and action that we also need. We need people who will actually question the premises and not just try and improve what we have already.
I don't know if this is recency bias, but we set up this interview. I wanted to speak to you about AWS. As we're talking right now, Microsoft's Azure is down. Is this just recency bias, or is this stuff happening more frequently? And are we going to be seeing this happen more in the future?
Yes, yes, and yes. I mean, we do tend to see the things more often when we're focused on them. And this thing happens more often than people would like to admit. The scale of the impact, tends to generate more or less attention depending on who it specifically hits. And yes, are we likely to see this more in the future? Absolutely. Will the impact be bigger every time? Yes. Because one of the biggest things that we have on our radar is that there are a lot of sectors that are not yet digitized who are immediately going to make the jump to the cloud. So whatever the next iteration of this is, just because of that, the impact will likely be even bigger than the last one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking about how excited I was when finally the trains and buses here in LA, I was able to not have to carry around that dumb card and I could use my app. And I mean, this is a real thing because also here in LA, they are introducing police at the entrance points. I would very much like to not get harassed by the police because all of a sudden my phone isn't working to unlock my app so that I can get on the train and they think that I'm lying to them that I have paid for my fare.
Yep.
It isn't just that these companies are all at risk of experiencing another outage. A lot of Corinne's work is looking at all the ways that these companies control how we live our lives and what it means to have so much power. I want to point out something that AWS did that I think a lot of people maybe were a fan of, actually. In 2021, AWS pulled Parler from being able to use their servers. Just for context here, Parler, think of it as it's another social media app, which was pretty explicitly right-wing. Let's just say that. A lot of far-right personalities had pretty big followings there. And after January 6th, a little bit after January 6th, AWS said, hey, listen, we're not hosting this anymore. And I think they told Parler that it found 98 posts on the site that encouraged violence. A lot of people said, good, Amazon doing the right thing.
Right.
Could that potentially cut both ways?
Absolutely. At Article 19, we have spent a decade documenting, researching, and intervening in both corporate and government abuse of these infrastructures to quell dissent, to make it harder to organize, to make it harder for human rights defenders to speak up. What this has shown us is the specific power dynamic of how these cloud companies get to decide who gets to use their services, and by extension, who gets to exercise their rights online. When so few companies control the infrastructure, they also effectively control the flow of information, and that has real implications for our ability to organize, to find community, to access information, to exercise your freedom of expression.
Yeah, I mean, so many people rely on Signal. Signal relies on AWS.
Yeah.
And what happens if, for some political reason, Amazon decides no more Signal?
Right.
Now, I think it's very reasonable to assume, at least at this stage, they'd never do that. They never do that. Okay, what if they do?
Right. We need to just be prepared for these kind of scenarios and make sure that these companies have a sense of accountability for their role. It's the Spider-Man quote. It's like great power, great responsibility.
So how do we hold that great responsibility? How do we keep them accountable?
As individual persons, it's very hard. Like, I know that people said like, oh, you can start self-hosting all of your stuff and like that's possible. But then, try and self-host your own email right now and then get through the Gmail filters. Just forget about it. But I do think there are other steps that we can and should be taking. Like, I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Dr. Isa Stasi, who is a lawyer at Article 19, who is currently taking Microsoft to court for unfair licensing practices. Right? There are things that people can do. It's very hard. And, the entirety of the weight of that corporate power comes bearing down on you. So you need to have the kind of, backbone to take on that backbone.
So unless you're the head of some massive tech company that's also using AWS or Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud, the decision on demonopolizing the internet probably isn't directly in your hands. This is a big problem, and it's not something that any one of us as an individual is going to fix. But at the very least, this is another instance where we should be able to have some transparency. Companies don't have to answer all of our questions, but governments are a little different. We should be able to ask our local officials what the hospital is depending on to keep people alive, and what the backup plan is when, not if, but when that service goes offline next. It's a small thing, but maybe that's one step toward thinking about this stuff a little differently.
This is Click Here, and you've been listening to an episode from Kill Switch, a series from Kaleidoscope and iHeartMedia. Special thanks to host Dexter Thomas. You can listen to more episodes wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Dina Temple-Raston, and Click Here will be back on Friday with a mic drop. We'll see you then.